I still remember the night as if it were etched into my bones. The night they decided I wasn't strong enough. The room smelled faintly of stale coffee and old carpet, the kind of smell that lingers in spaces long after laughter and conversation have faded. My parents sat on opposite ends of the living room, their faces tight with impatience, while I clutched a thin folder of papers that might as well have been my lifeline. I had just signed the divorce papers. "You really think you can manage on your own?" my father asked, his voice sharp, almost accusatory. There was no warmth in his eyes, only a quiet disbelief, a disappointment that pierced me deeper than any shouting ever could. My mother didn't speak, but her stare said the same thing. They had always been proud of appearances, of family reputation, of control. And now here I was, failing to live up to their unspoken standards. I tried to explain softly, gently, that I had a plan, that I had a job lined up, savings tucked away, and dreams that extended beyond the walls of that judgmental living room. But words bounced off the walls like a ball against concrete. They weren't listening. They had already decided I was too fragile, too young, too inexperienced to survive. And somehow, in that moment, I began to believe them. The betrayal didn't come as a yell or a slam of a door. It came in glances, in the way my mother's hand rested on her lap as if I were invisible, in the small shake of my father's head that said, "You'll see. You'll fail." Their distrust was like a slow leak in my chest. I felt it pooling in my stomach, heavy and quiet, and I realized that survival wasn't just going to be about money or a roof over my head. It was going to be about my own strength, which I barely knew I possessed. The nights that followed were the hardest. I packed my belongings into my little car, leaving behind everything that smelled like home. The walls, the furniture, even their faces had become reminders that love and support could be conditional. I drove away with my hands on the wheel, trembling not from fear of the road, but from the realization that for the first time, no one was going to protect me. Not them, not him, not anyone. I remember sitting alone in my tiny apartment that first week, staring at the peeling paint and the flickering light bulb above the kitchen sink, and feeling utterly invisible. It would have been easy to crumble, to let their words become my reality, but there was something stubborn in me, a small spark that refused to be extinguished. I whispered to it quietly every night, "You can survive, you will survive." It wasn't a heroic moment. There were no dramatic speeches or tearful confrontations. Survival began in silence, in the gentle routine of making my bed, paying my bills, and showing up to work even when my body and heart felt like lead. Every small decision, buying my own groceries, cooking my own meals, filing my taxes on time, was a quiet declaration that I wasn't as weak as they believed. At work, I noticed the glances of colleagues who pitied me. I learned quickly to carry my quiet strength beneath a calm exterior, to let my actions speak where words would falter. I didn't need them to acknowledge my effort. I only needed to believe it myself. Slowly, painstakingly, I began to understand that the life they had tried to define for me, full of dependence and whispered doubts, wasn't the life I was meant to live. That night, the memory of their disapproval, their disbelief, and their quiet dismissal became a quiet, driving force inside me. It wasn't anger that fueled me. It was clarity. They had underestimated me, misjudged me, and assumed I would fail. And in that assumption, I found a secret ally myself. By the time I fell asleep in that small apartment, with the hum of the city below my window, I didn't feel invincible. I felt alone, but in that solitude, I felt possibility. For the first time, I realized that surviving wasn't just about proving them wrong. It was about proving to myself that I could be trusted, that I could be my own foundation, that my worth wasn't tied to their belief or disbelief. And so, quietly, without spectacle, I began my life anew. One step, one decision, one small victory at a time. After the divorce, I thought I had reached the edge of heartbreak. I was wrong. Life had a way of teaching me that betrayal isn't always loud. Sometimes it is the quiet dismissal, the slow erosion of trust, the subtle tightening of doors that were once open. I had found a new rhythm, a fragile one, in my small apartment. Work became my anchor. My colleagues were kind enough, polite, and occasionally helpful, but there was a ceiling I could feel pressing above me, one I hadn't yet hit, but that others seemed eager to enforce. I was young, a woman starting over in a world that didn't always make space for someone like me. I was careful, diligent, and grateful for every small recognition, every faint smile of approval. I believed in honesty and loyalty, and I thought that was enough. Then came the day that shattered that belief. I had been working at a mid-sized marketing firm for 2 years. I had poured my energy into my projects, stayed late when no one was watching, and celebrated quietly whenever a campaign succeeded. I believed my work would speak for itself, but one afternoon, my manager, someone I had trusted and admired, called me into a meeting with the executives. I walked in with a polite smile, expecting a conversation about a new project. Instead, I found myself facing cold, calculated eyes. "You're no longer a fit for this company," my manager said. The words fell into the room like a brick hitting water. I blinked, confused. My brain refused to connect them to reality. What do you mean? Your position has been eliminated. We appreciate your contributions, but it's time to move on. It wasn't anger I felt in that moment. It was disbelief. Betrayal doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers in the form of polite corporate phrases, neatly typed termination letters, and forced smiles. I wanted to ask why, wanted to plead my case, wanted to make them see the truth of my effort. But something inside me, a quiet, stubborn ember, told me to leave the argument unspoken. I walked out of that office, my hands shaking, my vision blurring. The world outside the glass doors seemed impossibly loud. Every cheerful conversation, every honking car, every casual laugh felt like a reminder that my life had been quietly dismantled while I was still learning to trust again. The nights that followed were filled with the same heavy silence I had come to know after my divorce. I would sit at my small kitchen table, staring at my laptop, trying to figure out what went wrong. I thought of my parents, of their disbelief in me, and I realized with a sinking heaviness that this was another form of the same lesson. Some people, even those closest to you, cannot see your strength until it is too late. For weeks, I replayed every moment at work, analyzing, questioning, wondering if I had missed a warning sign. But slowly, painfully, I understood that this wasn't about my mistakes. It was about their comfort, their greed, their fear. They had taken the safe route, choosing expedience over fairness, appearances over loyalty, and in that realization, a strange clarity emerged. I started small, freelance projects, consulting for friends' businesses, quietly rebuilding a foundation that depended only on me. No one was applauding, no one noticed, and yet, every evening, as I logged off my computer and drank my tea in silence, I felt a small, growing power inside me. I was learning that survival and success weren't about proving anyone else wrong. They were about honoring myself, keeping my integrity intact even when the world seemed determined to take it away. Months turned into years. I worked with diligence, saving, learning, observing. I studied the industry from every angle, understanding the people who had betrayed me, learning the gaps they left in their own systems. I watched quietly, taking notes in my mind while the world moved on around me. I did not rush, I did not boast, I did not complain. My pain became a teacher and my patience a weapon. By the end of that second year, I understood something essential. Betrayal, when faced with quiet resilience, loses its power. It cannot touch a soul that has learned to depend on itself, The people who had dismissed me, judged me, or fired me, none of that mattered anymore. What mattered was the slow, deliberate reconstruction of a life that I could be proud of, built on my own terms. The silence after the applause, I realized, was not emptiness. It was space, space to think, to grow, to prepare for a future they could not imagine. And it was in that silence that I began to see the path forward, not loud, not dramatic, but clear, patient, and mine entirely. The years that followed were quiet, almost invisible from the outside, but inside a storm of growth was brewing. I had learned the most powerful lessons in solitude, in moments when no one was watching, when there was no audience, no applause, and no validation but my own. I realized that strength was not measured in dramatic gestures or revenge. It was measured in the small, consistent acts of living with integrity, even when betrayal had left its mark. I spent long evenings reflecting on my past, not to dwell on the pain, but to understand it. I realized that my parents' disbelief, my ex-husband's dismissal, and my former employer's betrayal were all echoes of the same truth. Some people cannot see your value until you have fully realized it yourself, and so I began to invest in me, not in their approval. I learned to trust my instincts, to rely on my quiet judgment, and to protect my energy fiercely. Professionally, I built slowly but deliberately. I started small consulting projects, freelance campaigns, helping local businesses grow their brand. I listened more than I spoke, observed more than I acted, and learned more than I dared to dream aloud. With each successful project, I felt a quiet pride, a deepening sense that my worth was not determined by anyone's recognition. I was no longer the woman who trembled at a cold dismissal or flinched at doubt. I was becoming someone who moved with purpose and clarity, someone who understood her own power. The transformation wasn't immediate. There were mornings when I doubted myself, when the old voices of disapproval whispered in my ear, telling me I would fail again. But I had learned to acknowledge those voices without surrendering to them. I journaled, I meditated, I reminded myself that pain could be a teacher, not a prison. Slowly, the trembling gave way to calm. The uncertainty gave way to quiet confidence. The hurt became a reminder, not a chain. One of the most important lessons I learned was observation. I began to notice patterns, how people treated others when no one was watching, how decisions were made in silence, how integrity often demanded patience rather than confrontation. I watched my former company from afar, quietly tracking their growth, their missteps, their blind spots. I did not gloat or wish them harm, I merely noted. Time, I realized, would reveal truths more clearly than anger ever could. I also rebuilt my personal life with care. Friendships that were once casual became profound. I invested in people who valued honesty and empathy. I learned to set boundaries, to speak my truth softly but firmly, and to protect my emotional energy like a precious resource. For the first time, I understood the difference between being alone and being lonely. Solitude was not a punishment. It was a space for refinement, a quiet place to cultivate resilience, wisdom, and grace. It was during these years that I discovered the depth of my own emotional intelligence. I could read people not with suspicion, but with clarity. I could sense intentions without needing words. I could navigate difficult situations without needing to prove myself. And in the process, I discovered a deep well of patience I had never known existed. Patience, I realized, was not passive. It was active, deliberate, and powerful. 10 years had passed since the divorce, since the dismissal, since the moments of quiet humiliation that once seemed unbearable. And yet, in that decade, I had transformed. I had learned that dignity is not something given. It is something claimed quietly, every day, through choices, discipline, and self-respect. I had become a woman who did not need anyone's validation to know her worth, who could walk through life with grace, and who understood that true strength is often invisible until it is undeniable. And then came the moment I had been preparing for without even knowing it. The moment when the past and the present would meet, when the silence of years would speak louder than any confrontation ever could. I had built something, not just professionally, but emotionally, spiritually, and mentally, that could not be shaken by anyone's disbelief. I was no longer a girl trying to survive. I was a woman who had quietly become unstoppable, not through anger, but through clarity, patience, and self-respect. And so, as I prepared to step into that boardroom, the room where betrayal and dismissal had once defined me, I did so with calm, with dignity, and with the unshakable knowledge that I was exactly where I was meant to be. I didn't need to shout, to accuse, or to demand recognition. Time and truth had already done the work for me. All I had to do was walk in. The morning of the meeting, I woke with a sense of calm I hadn't felt in years. There was no trembling in my hands, no doubt clouding my mind, only clarity. I had spent a decade quietly building my life, my company, and my sense of self. Every late night, every small victory, every lesson learned in solitude had led me here. And now, the world I had carefully constructed would intersect, unexpectedly, with the past I had left behind. The boardroom was vast and modern, sunlight streaming through floor, to ceiling windows. My team had already gathered, reviewing final projections, discussing strategy. I stood at the head of the table, notes in hand, observing the quiet energy of my company, thriving without me needing to assert control through fear or aggression. Everything about this room reflected effort, precision, and care, my care. Then he walked in, my ex. The same man who had dismissed me 10 years ago, the one who had watched me leave our marriage with thinly veiled relief. His posture was confident, polished. He wore the suit of someone accustomed to power, but the moment his eyes met mine, I saw something shift. Not fear exactly, but recognition, a pause, a quiet recalibration. For a moment the room seemed smaller, narrower, though I remained entirely calm. I didn't flinch, I didn't soften my gaze, and I didn't give him the satisfaction of panic or aggression. He could see me, truly see me, for the first time since he had underestimated me. And in that look I realized the most satisfying truth. I didn't need him to acknowledge me. I only needed him to witness the life I had quietly, deliberately built. He took a seat across from me, and the meeting began. Our conversation was professional, restrained. Numbers, projections, strategy. He spoke first, attempting to assert his old authority, but I had learned to listen first, respond calmly, and never let ego dictate my actions. Every question he asked, I answered with confidence and clarity. Every proposal he made, I evaluated with precision and discretion. I was not rushing to prove anything. I was operating from the calm certainty of experience and competence. I noticed him stealing glances at me during the discussion, a subtle tightening around his jaw, a brief hesitation before he spoke. He was realizing, piece by piece, that the woman he had dismissed was no longer the one who might stumble or plead for approval. I moved through the agenda methodically, articulating ideas, guiding decisions, and commanding respect, not through force, but through quiet intelligence. The room, my team, and even he responded naturally to that clarity. It was undeniable, not because I demanded recognition, but because it emanated effortlessly from my presence. At one point he leaned back, a small sigh escaping him. Frustration, disbelief, perhaps both. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I simply continued, steady and calm, navigating the conversation with the measured grace I had cultivated over years of silence, observation, and self-reflection. The power I held in that moment was not external, it was internal, rooted in knowledge of my worth and the dignity I had earned. When the meeting concluded, he left the room before I did. Our eyes met one final time at the doorway. No words were exchanged. But in that silent glance, I understood everything. He recognized the life I had built, the strength I had developed, and the fact that his disbelief no longer held any sway over me. I didn't need to shout, to punish, or to prove myself. Time, effort, and quiet perseverance had done all of that already. After he walked away, my team gathered around, congratulating me not only on the meeting, but on the poise and clarity with which I had navigated it. I smiled, not for their approval, but because I felt the calm satisfaction that comes from knowing your integrity has carried you through. I had survived betrayal, dismissal, and doubt, not by reacting with anger, but by cultivating patience, self-respect, and quiet power. Later, alone in my office, I allowed myself a moment to reflect. I realized that the greatest victory of all was not in witnessing his surprise or recognition. It was in my own journey, the slow, deliberate path from pain and doubt to confidence and wisdom. I had built a life that required no validation from anyone who had once sought to diminish me. I had set boundaries, honored myself, and quietly commanded respect through action and integrity. And in that quiet realization, I felt a profound peace. Not because I had defeated anyone, but because I had honored myself. The lesson of those 10 years was clear. Strength does not need to be loud, and dignity does not need to be aggressive. The most powerful form of justice is living fully, gracefully, and intentionally, showing the world, and yourself, that you are enough. I leaned back in my chair, the sunlight warming my face, and whispered to myself, I survived, I grew. And now I am free.